So in this tutorial we're going to be looking at how to create React forms, handle all the state within the form, and we're actually going to be submitting the form data to a third-party API service, which will capture all of the form data into a service, so we don't need to worry about creating our own backend to contain all of the form data. So the third-party service is called FormSpark, and you'll see how you can use them to actually capture all of your data from the forms, and we'll also be adding ReCAPTCHA to prevent spam submissions. So let's take a look at a demo and then start coding up our React form.
Okay, so this is what the contact form is going to look like once it's finished, and as you can see there's a few fields that you can fill out, and we've got the ReCAPTCHA service provided by Google to stop spam submissions coming through. And when we click the submit button here, these fields, the data that the user types in actually gets sent to the third-party service, which is FormSpark as mentioned, and you get a dashboard with FormSpark that looks a little bit like this. And when you actually create a submission, all of the data that gets sent appears in the table here. So let's just test that out and show you how that looks. We'll enter a name and an email address and just a test message. And of course we have to complete the reCAPTCHA as well. And then if we then submit this, we just get a message to say that the form has been submitted and the form is then reset. And if we go back on over to FormSpark and just refresh this table here, you can see we've got a new entry in the table with all of the data that we typed into the form. So you'll notice each of these items here match the actual names of the fields in the form. And that's what makes FormSpark quite flexible, is that you can add as many or as few fields as you like. You don't have to pre-configure those in the form when you set it up. So what we'll be doing in this tutorial is taking a basic React app and implementing the form, setting up a form within FormSpark, and getting those submissions flowing through. And towards the end of the tutorial, I'll show you how to set up the reCAPTCHA as well. Okay, so let's go back to our app and actually reset this to a blank template. And if you clone the repository from the link in the description below from GitHub, you can then just go to the setup branch, and what you'll have is a nice blank React template that has things like Tailwind set up and configured, and we've also got a couple of extra bits and pieces in there as well, such as Axios, which we'll be using to make our network requests to the FormSpark service. Okay, so everything's pretty much set up ready for us to go. You'll notice in the app.css file we've got the Tailwind libraries loaded in, and the app.tsx file is just an empty React component. Okay, so the way I'm going to approach this first section is to actually get us set up with a very basic form that doesn't have any fields in at the moment, but actually submit some data to FormSpark so we can check that's all working. And then once we've got that process set up, we'll actually go and flesh out the form and add in the name, email and message fields that we had in the example to start off with. And of course, if you want to put your own fields in, you can put anything you like in there. So let's just put a heading level 1 tag to get us started. And the text can be anything you like, but I'm going to use contact us here. And using some Tailwind classes, I'm going to make the text a lot larger with 4XL as the text size. I'm going to make it bold. And I'm also going to set this as a flex container with the items centered because I want to add a little icon next to the contact us text. And I just used hero icons for that, I think, in the previous example. I think there's like a little plane icon, this paper aeroplane here, so I can just copy the JSX code here from hero icons and pop this next to the contact us text. Could do with making it a little bit larger, maybe set the height to 12. Also can use some Tailwind classes here to actually rotate it as well, so if we add transform and then rotate 45, it'll angle it for us, which isn't perfect, but it'll be okay for our design today. And let's actually put this in a container as well, so that it's not right up against the edge of the page there. So I'm going to put another div with the h1 inside. And for this inner div here, we'll give that some classes. We'll say it's the width is 2/3 of the outer container, and the margin is auto, and we'll add some padding along with a box shadow. And what we'll also do here on the outer div container, just make sure this is full height of the page, and we'll also set this as a flex container with the items centered, and just set that as a flex column. So if we put any more content in there, it would stack as a column. Okay, so that's our basic setup for our contact form. Well, let's actually add the form elements underneath that. So we don't want to necessarily have an action for it at the moment, but when we do submit it, we're going to call it a function that we'll create in a moment. And we'll just call that submit form. As I say, we're going to just do a test with this to start off with, just to show you how the FormSpark API works. So the only thing I'm going to put in there is a single button, and the text in there will just say submit. And we might as well add some classes to that while we're here as well, so a class name. We'll give it a bit of margin on the top and bottom, and we'll set the background to blue. The text is white, and the width is going to be full. And a bit of padding, and also when we hover over that, we'll set the background blue colour to a deeper blue, to 900, and we'll also transition the colours for a duration of 200 milliseconds. Okay, so we've got an error in the app at the moment, and that's because this submit form function doesn't exist at the moment, so let's just create a placeholder for that for the minute, just so the error disappears. And there you go, we've got a submit button which darkens as we hover over it. Okay, so we're going to hook this up with some test data to make sure that it's working before we create the rest of the form. So to do that, we're going to actually create a new form within FormSpark. So over in your dashboard, once you've signed up for an account, if you go to the form section here and just create a new form, we'll just call it tutorial example. You'll notice there is actually information on how to set this up with lots of different frameworks, including React, and it will actually give you all of the information on how to do that if you select the relevant framework. But I'm actually just using the API for it. There's a post endpoint that you can submit your form data to, and we're going to be using that for our example because it's the most flexible, and also it will teach you how to actually make the API requests. And if you find this service somewhere else as well, you can obviously pretty much copy the code and just amend it for that other service provider. So if we just create a new form there, you can see we've got some settings for it here, and the main thing that we need to know is the form ID. So I'm just going to copy that onto my clipboard for the moment. And then back within our app component, I'm going to just create a variable with that value there, so that we can use it when we're creating our request to FormSpark. So the other thing we're going to need to know is where we're actually submitting our data to. So there is a URL that they provide to you in the documentation, and it's HTTPS, and the domain name is submitform.com. And then all you need to do after the last / is just pass in your form ID, and that's where we're going to be sending our data to. Okay, so with that information available, what we can now do is complete the submit form function, and this won't change throughout the rest of the tutorial. As I say, once we've got this set up and working, we can add as many form fields as we like, and the function's going to take in the event from the form object or when the user submits the form. And we're going to prevent the default action, which is to reload the page. And I'm actually going to put the process of submitting the form into its own separate function, and then call that from here, just to separate out the actions for what's happening within our component. And the first thing I'm going to do is create a payload variable, which is what we're going to send as the post request to FormSpark. And I'm just going to create one property in there called message, saying test FormSpark submission, for example. And then what we're going to do is use Axios to actually send a request to that FormSpark URL. And we'll capture the result into a variable there. So we'll use the await keyword to post. And as you can see from the IntelliSense here, the first argument is the URL and the second is the data, in our case the payload variable that we created. So the URL that we're going to use is the FormSpark URL, which will have our unique form ID in there. And then the second argument we'll pass in is that payload object. Okay, and then we'll just log that to the console so you can see what the response looks like when it comes back. Hopefully we won't get any errors, but if we do, let's log those to the console there. And that's the basic process of submitting data to FormSpark. Basically, we need to send a post request to the FormSpark URL and send any payload, which will be an object that has the properties that we want to show up in the table within the FormSpark dashboard. And that should be pretty much all we need to do to actually submit our form. So let's go over and actually test that out. Let's just have the console open so we can see if there are any errors. And if we click submit, and you can see we've got a 200 response back, which is a good response. So let's have a look in our dashboard and look at the submissions within FormSpark, and we should see that test message that we sent from our post submission function appearing there, which it is. Okay, so obviously we don't want to hard code the message each time. We want the user to be able to actually provide us with some information for our forms. So that's the second part of our app that we're going to work on now. And that's going to basically involve us creating those HTML form inputs and then passing them to the post submission function to actually send to FormSpark via this Axios call. Okay, so we're going to need some state for that to handle our form elements. So let's set that up here. So we'll say form state and set form state is equal to use state. And we're using TypeScript within this project as well, so we can actually type this form state in here so that we can have some help within our code. So let's set up a new type up here. So let's create a type called form state. And the form elements that we're going to create are email, which is going to be a string, name, which is going to be a string, and also finally message, which will also be a string. So that's the type of data that's going to be stored within our state here. And I'm actually going to initialize this as well so that the form has some default values in there. So I'll just create a variable inside the app called initial form state, which is just an object, which basically mirrors the form state type that we just created. So we've got a property called email, which is blank, name, which is blank, and also message, which is blank. So if you wanted any of the form elements to have any pre-configured values, then obviously you could set those there. So when we initialize our state here, I'm just going to initialize it with the form state object that we created up here. Okay, so we've got our state available here. We can actually start working on our form and put in our form elements into this, so that those new inputs. So let's first of all put some styling onto the form itself. I'm going to set it as a flex container in a column, and then the submit button we want to be the last thing in the form. So here's going to be a containing div which will contain the label and also the input itself. So we're going to have a label, and the first input is going to be for name. Again, you can choose any data types or field names that you want, but that's what we had in the original example. So I'm going to give this some classes as well. Just a bit of border. Tailwind removes all the borders from the inputs by default, so let's just add them back in there, and a bit of padding as well. And I'm going to give it a specific ID which matches the HTML4 attribute that we created for the label. So if you want to click on the label, it will actually take you to this input as well. And we also need to set a value on it. And the value is going to be basically the form state dot name. So when we set our state up here, when the component is initialized, we'll have this object created, and this name property will basically be the value that's provided to this input here. So if you haven't worked with forms too much in React before, you might get a bit confused by this next part here. You'll see in our console we've actually got an error here saying we've got a value to our input field here, but we don't actually have an onChange event handler set up. And if you actually try and type into the box here, I'm actually typing on the keyboard at the moment, it won't actually accept any of your input. So basically this is a read-only field at the moment, so this is not something that we want for our form. We want it to be able to update. So we need to create an update handler and assign that to the onChange event. So let's do that now. So we're going to say onChange update form control. So we could create a specific one for each of the inputs that we're creating, but I'm going to create a generic update form control function here, which I can reuse for all of the other inputs that we're going to create. Okay, so let's create that function up here. And it's basically going to take an event, which essentially is a change event, which is a generic type. And the two types of inputs that we're going to be receiving events for is either a HTML input element or the HTML text area element, which we'll use in just a moment for our message field. So how are we going to update the form controls? Well, we need to update the state, which we set above here, so this form state object here. And of course it's immutable, so we need to create a copy of it and then update the relevant property that's changed. So let's first of all destructure the ID and value from the event.target. And I'm also going to create a new variable called form key, which is just equal to the ID. And you'll see why I'm doing that in just a moment. But what we want to do is create a new variable called updated form state, which is just a shallow copy of the original or current state. And then on that updated form state, we can access the form key property, which is essentially the ID property that we set here on the form control. So it will be name in this example. And then we just assign that the value that came from the event here, which essentially is what the user has typed into the box here. And then once that's done, all we do is set the form state to the updated form state object. So we're kind of overwriting the existing form state with the changes that have been made to this updated form state object that we copied here. And let's just say updated form state. Okay, so you'll notice we're getting this error, and if you hover over it, it basically says that we can't actually access the index type of email, name, or message directly as a string because ID is essentially just a string, which is a bit weird because we should just be able to access the name property of the updated form state object just like this, but TypeScript's checking that we're actually trying to do that safely and it decides that we're not. So the solution for that is the ID string that we have here, we just say it's a key of the form state. And you can see that error message has gone away and TypeScript's happy that we're actually accessing the object of form state with the correct key. Okay, so let's save that. If we clear the console now, we should then now be able to type into the input box that we've created, and what is happening in the background is this update form control function is being run, and we're setting the name property of the form state to have the value that we're typing in here. So that's really handy because now we can reuse that function for the other controls, and we can pretty much just copy this one for the next field, which is for email. So instead of having name here, we have email. And also make sure we set the ID to email, because that is what the update form control is using to update the state. And we'll also set the value here for email too. And then the last one's reasonably similar, except this time we're going to actually use, instead of an input field, we're using a text area HTML input. But we still want to make sure that we've got the ID the same. We've still got that set as email there. So we'll just call it message. Message again. And the ID is message. Okay, and we want to add the classes on there as well. So we'll use the same thing as we had above, border 2 and padding 2. And of course we need to add in the events as well. So on change is update form control, and the actual value inside there is form state.message. Okay, so we've got our 3 form inputs in there. We should be able to type into all of those. Okay. But if we hit the submit button now, we're still going to be sending that same payload that we had in hard-coded in the post-submission function. But this is actually really easy to actually get this data now. Now we have it saved in a form state object. What we can actually do, instead of having this as the payload, we can just spread in the form state and make a copy of that in there. And that will replace the payload when we submit it to FormSpark. So it shouldn't just now just be a case of saving that. And if we hit submit, so we get our 200 response coming back, so that should have gone through okay. And if we refresh the table within FormSpark, you can see, as before, the message that we sent from our form has gone successfully through to FormSpark. Okay, so we've pretty much got a working form at this point, but there's lots of things that we can do to improve this. The first thing I'm going to do is just add a couple of bits of state into the actual app itself, or the app component rather. And the first will be a bit of state, and I'll just call this submitting, and set submitting. And that will just be a boolean, so we'll use state of boolean, and we'll set it as initial value as false. And the other bit is going to be a message, so we can display a message to the user, whether or not the form submission was successful. And that one again will be a call to the use state hook. And I'm going to create another type for that as well. So we'll say a type of, I'm going to call it service message, so it's a bit more specific than just the word message. And I want to have a property on there called class, which will be a string. So we'll add some styling to the message when it's displayed, and the actual message text itself. So let's use that type here when we're setting our state. And I'll just leave that as null for when it gets initialized. Okay, so there's two things I can do with this state now. When we actually submit our form up here, what I will do is I will say, before we actually send the data, I'm going to set submitting to be true. And either way, if it's been successful or not, I'm going to set the submitting state to false after the post submission has finished. So with the submitting state variable, what we can do down here in the button that we have here, what we can say is we can set it to be disabled if submitting is true. And also we can change the text as well, just temporarily. So if the form submission is in progress, we can say submitting. But if not, we'll just default that to what we had before, which was submit. So we'll check that in a moment when we try submitting the form again. But what I want to do as well with the other state that we created, which was for message, is we're going to set a message depending on whether the post submission was successful or not. So if it was successful, we'll set a message with a class of background green 500, another tailwind class. And we'll set some text as well. Again, this can be customized for your liking, but we'll say thanks. Someone will be in touch shortly. But if there is a problem, we want to notify the user of that. This time what we'll do, instead of having a green background, we'll set the background to be red, and we'll change the message here saying, sorry, there was a problem. Please try again, or contact support. Appreciate it's a bit ironic saying try and contact support from a contact form, but it is only just an example. We'd probably have something else for the user to get in touch with us if the problem persisted, but this will do for our example. Okay, so we need to display that message to the user as well. So just above where the H1 finishes, we'll just check the message is truthy there, if there's something assigned to it. And if it is, we're going to display a div in here. And the div will have a class name of, I'm going to open up a template string here so we can actually use the class that's inside of the message as well. So margin top and bottom of 4, text is white, width, just check that it's full across the page, and some padding as well. And then we'll also add in the message.class, so that'll be background red or background green depending on whether it was success or failure. And we also need to show the message itself as well, so message.text. And if we save that now. Okay, if we try and submit the page again with some test data, we just submit that. You can see the submitting text was shown there as well, and we've got our success message up there on the top of the form too. So if we go back to FormSpark and just refresh the page, okay, you can see the message has still gone through okay, and we've got the visual feedback for the user on the form as well. Okay, so we've got a decent working form at the moment. The only thing that we need to add on as well is to have some kind of spam protection. And in the example at the start of the tutorial, we were using ReCAPTCHA to handle that. So let's do that and add that to our form before we finish up the tutorial. Okay, so I'm actually going to use a pre-built package for ReCAPTCHA. I know there are a few of them about for React, but this one seems to work okay for me. So the package has a default export, so I'm just going to name it ReCAPTCHA, and the package name is React Google ReCAPTCHA. Again, if you've downloaded the repository, this will be included in the package.json file, but if you're following along in some other way, just go and install npm install React Google ReCAPTCHA, and you should have this package available. Okay, and we need a bit of information to get this ReCAPTCHA working on the page. So to start off with, we're going to need a ReCAPTCHA key, which we'll get in just a second. And I'm also going to have a ref in React to this ReCAPTCHA element that's going to be on the page. So we'll use the useRef hook, and I think the typings are slightly weird on it, so let's just type it as any, so that TypeScript doesn't complain about anything. So this will just hold a reference to the actual ReCAPTCHA HTML element on the page, so we can actually reset it once the form has been submitted. Okay, so let's add that in to our form. So we're going to be using the tick box ReCAPTCHA in this example, so it actually appears on the form, not like the invisible one which appears at the side of the page. So all we need to do is with our library that we've imported here, which make a reference to the reCAPTCHA package here. And the first thing we want to do is set the reCAPTCHA ref to the variable ref that we created just above there. And then we also need to set the site key, and that will be the reCAPTCHA key variable that we created at the top of the page. And also, when it changes, when the user clicks the button to say they're not a robot, we want to update the reCAPTCHA token, which is a function that gets called when the user actually clicks the tick box. So let's create that function up here now before we do anything else. And this function just receives an argument, which is the token. It can also be null as well, so let's just check for that particular type in case that does come through too. And so what we're going to do when the user ticks the tick box to say they're not a robot is we want to set the token that gets received into part of our state. So we could amend our form state type up here to actually have the reCAPTCHA token within there as well. But I think that's a little bit inflexible. I think it's nice to keep these user input fields, email, name and message, separate from the anti-spam reCAPTCHA. So I'll just set another bit of state on the component to hold the reCAPTCHA token. So reCAPTCHA token, and also a setter as well for that. So set reCAPTCHA token, and it'll just be a string for the token, so that we'll type that as such. And so now in our function down here, when the user ticks the tick box, we'll update the reCAPTCHA token, which will literally just set the reCAPTCHA token state to the token that's been provided. And as mentioned, it can be null, so just to make TypeScript happy, we'll just make sure that that's set as a string when it's stored on the state. Okay, so if we save that now, we should see an error on the console here just saying that we don't have all of the required parameters, and that's basically because we're just passing it an empty key at the moment, so we need to get a reCAPTCHA key to actually make the reCAPTCHA system work. So if you've never used reCAPTCHA before, what you can do is just head on over to the Google site for creating reCAPTCHAs, which is just at google.com reCAPTCHA admin create. I'll put a link to this in the description below. All you need to do is give it a label with using the I'm not a robot tick box, and you can add any emails for the actual notifications on this. And for the domain, if you're just going to be testing it out, you just want to set it as localhost. But obviously, if you're going to be using it somewhere else, you need to make sure you've got the right domain in there. So I've got one that I've used previously for the example that I showed you earlier on. And when you generate a new reCAPTCHA, you'll get two keys. The first is for the client side, so it's a kind of public key. So we can put that straight into our code base because we're not too worried if anyone knows what our public key is. But the other one is the secret key, which is used to verify any of the reCAPTCHA submissions that come through. And so because FormSpark's handling of form submissions for us, we need to let them know what our private key is so that they can verify those submissions for us. And luckily they do have a service that will do that for us. If you go back over to your dashboard and go into the settings section for your form and scroll down, you should see there's a spam protection drop down list there, and they offer a couple of different things, but we're going to be using reCAPTCHA here. And as you can see, they then ask for your secret key, which we can just then paste into that field, and don't forget to save those changes. And so now our app knows about the public key to actually generate reCAPTCHAs, and FormSpark knows about the private key so that it can verify any of the submissions. So if we save that now and go back to our app, it should be showing the reCAPTCHA for us. The only thing is we're not going to be sending this to FormSpark in our network request at the moment because we haven't configured our app to do that. And just to prove that, if we actually even click the reCAPTCHA button here and then click submit, you'll see we get an error coming back from FormSpark. Unfortunately, it's not very clear as to what the error is, but it's definitely because we haven't given them the reCAPTCHA key now. So how do we provide the reCAPTCHA key for them? Well, if you look at their documentation, you can see they're expecting it as a property on the payload that you send through as GReCAPTCHA response. So when we're creating our payload, we can just make sure that we pop that property onto the payload with our reCAPTCHA token. Okay, so let's go and find where we create our payload, which is in the post submission. And all we need to do there is create that property of GReCAPTCHA response. And then what we'll do is pass it the reCAPTCHA token that's stored in our state, in our component, as the value to that property. So let's save that again. So if we reload our app and just try and fill in the form again, This time if we click the tick box to verify the reCAPTCHA and then submit the form, you can see everything goes through okay, and we've now protected our form with reCAPTCHA. Okay, so just one final thing just to finish up. Once we've submitted the form, it would be nice if it reset and also reset the reCAPTCHA. So once we've got a successful form submission, all we need to do is set the form state to the initial form state object that we had when the component gets initialized. And then the other thing with our reCAPTCHA ref that we had, which again is a reference to the reCAPTCHA element that's been generated here, there's a property on there called current, and then we just call a function called reset. And fill in the form one last time. Make sure we verify our reCAPTCHA, and if we click submit, you can see this time all the form's been cleared and our reCAPTCHA has been reset, ready to accept a new submission. Okay, so that's the end of this tutorial, and we've created a contact form with several different fields, which is highly customizable. We could add as many inputs in there as we want, and the data will be sent and captured by FormSpark. And we've also added spam protection by adding the Google ReCAPTCHA service. There's still lots of things wrong with this form. We don't have anything in the way of validation. For example, name and email might be a required field. And we also might want to validate that the email is actually a valid email as well. And there's lots of improvements that we could make in terms of validating those fields, and also maybe only enable the submit button when those fields have been completed and the reCAPTCHA button has been clicked. But hopefully that's given you enough to start working with forms and the FormSpark service in React, and hopefully you've seen how you handle state when you're creating your own forms within your React apps. So that's it for this tutorial. Don't forget to subscribe to support the channel and so you don't miss out on any future tutorials. And thanks very much for watching. I'll see you next time.